Hello. Almost exactly on the dot, 109. Hello, and welcome to the This Is Not Therapy Hour. Apologies for the late start. It was a long and boring story that really is irrelevant, but I was not able to get here by the 1 o'clock start time. So appreciate you, anybody who is here and saw the banner and came back. I'm going to wait a minute before really getting going in case there were people who popped in, saw the banner, and are planning on coming back at 1:10, which it now is. Or if you've just been hanging out here, thanks. I appreciate that. And I apologize. I try very hard to make sure that that doesn't happen. Welcome. This is the This Is Not Therapy Hour. I'm Brandon Tessers. I'm a licensed therapist, but this is not therapy for very, very, very many reasons. I run a private therapy practice. We also have executive functioning coaching services. We provide individual, group, family, couple therapy, and individual executive functioning coaching, separate things. We're called Effective Artistry. That's our fun little logo up there in the top right corner. I think our website is down right now, so that's fun. But you can find us. Just Google Effective Artistry or on YouTube, Twitch, Facebook. This stream every week is just an open conversation. I'm here. It's open office hours, kind of. I think of it like, professors having open office hours. It's a way that I can be available to people who don't otherwise have access to somebody that can answer some questions about some things. And, I can only answer the questions that I can answer, or in the ways that I can. It's not all Q&A. It's just a conversation. I'm talking, I'm saying things. I'm at the very least imagining who you guys are watching this and what things you might be interested in, and we're changing and designing what I'm saying and what I do based on what I think might be of interest. For those of you who are here and in the chat, and I always appreciate when people are posting stuff in the chat, well, then I get to actually see, instead of just imagining what kinds of things you might want to hear or ask or talk about. I get to know from you. If you're on Twitch and you put something in the chat, it'll be under your Twitch account. If you're on Facebook, it'll be under your Facebook account, and YouTube, it'll be your Google account. And these videos stay up as VODs, like on YouTube and Facebook and Twitch. They can be viewed later, including the chat. So please feel free to put anything out there that you like, but just also be aware that it's publicly viewable. We always pick a topic. And lately, we've had Margaret Schaus, who's one of our staff therapists. She's been doing some stuff on TikTok for us, and she's been getting questions from people, things that they're interested in talking. So we have a topic for today and some questions. I have to pull that up. I haven't looked at any of that. Well, the topic is eating disorders. And we'll get into these questions. So we'll be talking about eating disorders. And we pick a topic so that we have something to talk about, so that we can generate some questions. So I'm not just kind of rambling on, as I have often done. But also, if you're here, you take precedence. If you have questions or comments or want to discuss the topic, great. But anything else, great. We'll shift to whatever you guys here want to be doing. So it doesn't all have to be about eating disorders. And I'm going to read some of these questions, and then we'll start getting into it. But I'll say here at the top, eating disorders is not my specialty by any means. I do work with people who have disordered eating. But this is a topic where I want to be careful and very clear about the fact that this is not my specialty. So I'm going to try not to, I don't want to give the impression that I'm like a final source of information. I'll share the things that I know that might be relevant, but mostly we'll probably be talking about it from the term, in terms of neurodiversity and executive functioning and how those things interact with eating and disordered eating and eating disorders, more so than like giving specific information about eating disorders. So, first question, difference between anorexia and bulimia. That's a good question, and there was a time where I could have answered that question confidently. I can still answer the question, I think, but I'm not as confident as I once was. I I actually might grab the DSM to look this up just to make sure. But from what I understand, bulimia is a pattern of what's the term that they use? Compensatory behaviors, that you do things to get rid of or prevent or burn calories rather than prevent calories in the first place. But I am going to check because I don't want to give the wrong impression. And somebody's asking, so let's talk about it. Because there are multiple versions of all of this. The exam that you have to take for second level licensure in Illinois requires that you more or less memorize diagnostic criteria for a lot of different things in the DSM. And with all exams, you cram for it. You learn it all, and then the stuff that you apply frequently, it sticks with you, and the stuff that you don't use frequently goes away. So anorexia does require, here's the diagnostic criteria: restriction of energy intake relative to requirements, leading to a significantly low body weight, intense fear of gaining weight or becoming fat, disturbance in the way in which one's body weight or shape is experienced. Yeah. But there is binge eating and purging type. That's what I was wanting to clarify, that that binge eating and purging can still be anorexia. So I want to have the specific, I think it is about the compensatory behaviors. Bulimia requires episodes of binge eating and then recurring and inappropriate compensatory behaviors. Yeah. Yep. Okay. Cool. I'm glad I remembered that well. That anorexia is about preventing the consumption of calories, or if you do consume them, purging those calories. Bulimia is more about the pattern of eating. Anorexia has these diagnostic criteria of that it has to be that in order for someone to be diagnosed with anorexia, that they have to have a fear of gaining weight. They have to be deliberately, to some extent, manipulating the way that they're eating in order to prevent themselves from gaining weight, and that they have to lose weight. It also has to be happening for a longer time, I believe, before it can be clinically diagnosed. I think it's 6 months. No, 3 months. The DSM, by the way, the Diagnostic and Statistic Manual 5 is the version we're on right now. This is the place that all of these things are codified. So in terms of what these things are and what they mean and blah, 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 different people are going to have different opinions, but the Diagnostic Statistic Manual, that's the official. If it's not in here, it doesn't officially exist. Insurance is not going to recognize it, for example. This is where it gets ICD-10 codes so that it can be coded on medical charts and things like that. So it has to meet the diagnostic criteria for a clinical diagnosis. But language is language. If it's useful to a person to use any language in here, even though they don't meet the clinical diagnostic criteria, then great. And if you do meet the clinical diagnostic criteria, but it is not useful for you to use that language, that label to identify, that's also great. Of course, not always. In any case, just like anything can be, utilized in a way that is harmful. There's also binge eating disorder, which involves the binge eating, but does not have the compensatory behaviors. Compensatory behaviors just means doing something like you might binge eat and then the next day work out for 3 hours or something like that. Inappropriate levels of behavior to try and make up for the binge eating. And yes, to prevent weight gain. It's interesting. I am curious, actually, about some of the specific details. I'm feeling a little rushed because I want to get on to the other questions. But now that I'm looking at it, I'm interested in it. What would be different between binge eating, purging type anorexia? They both are influenced by body shape and weight. It looks like anorexia specifically says must have, leads to a significantly low body weight, where that's not a criteria for bulimia. So bulimia could theoretically be that you have a I don't even know what term to use, all this fat phobic stuff. A more common body weight and still be bulimia, be diagnosed with bulimia. All right, best of my ability to answer that question. I want to look into it more, but I don't want to. How do I know if I have an eating disorder? Oh, good. Well, we were just talking about it. In terms of the clinical diagnosis of an eating disorder, you just check. I would bet, I know that with like other disorders listed in the DSM, I have just searched online and found the clinical diagnostic criteria listed. So you might be able to just Google, diagnostic criteria for anorexia or whatever. But that's the clinical diagnosis of eating disorder. How do I know if I have an eating disorder? That's how you know whether you meet those criteria. Whether you consider that, see, like I said, I'm trying to be careful here because this is not my area of expertise, and I try to learn and listen and be knowledgeable, but also be responsible about what messaging I'm giving. I'll say this: disordered eating and having an eating disorder are two different things. That doesn't mean that one is bad and one's okay or anything like that. They're just different things. Disordered eating just means a disordered pattern of eating. I have disordered eating, right? That is very common for people with ADHD. I don't notice hunger very well. I am literally just realizing as I'm saying this that I forgot to eat lunch again today. I get hyperfixated or invested in something. If I'm busy and distracted, I just forget to eat, and then sometimes we'll binge and eat a bunch of food at the end of the day because I haven't eaten all day. That's disordered eating. I don't have, as was the criteria for both anorexia and bulimia there, I am not doing that intentionally because I have some particular desire to shape my body or my image of my own body in some particular way. I'm not doing it for that reason. So typically we would say to have an eating disorder, well, see, this is where I want to be careful because I don't know that this is true of like binge eating disorder. But at least for those two, it's got to be significant concern about that you're doing it to some extent on purpose because of body image. There's a all right. Part of the problem, part of what is so part of why eating disorders are kind of their own category of disorders is because of the physical impact of the disorder, right? That you can damage your body even to the point of dying because of the behavior that you're engaging in that is a part of the disorder, considered to be a part of the disorder. So there's physical safety and health involved that isn't always involved to the same extent. And again, can we say that having ADHD or that having generalized anxiety disorder doesn't impact your health and safety? Of course not. Like those things impact your health and safety as well, but not in as clear and obvious and acute kind of a way as this. We can see people's body weight dropping, and we have really good evidence that suggests what happens if somebody's body weight continues to drop. Whereas those other ones are much less predictable and harder to isolate. So that's part of why I'm being very careful. It's part of why these things are treated as kind of their own separate like subcategory of disorders. So I want to be careful about that because I don't know what experts would say about how to know if you have an eating disorder. I would say, let me put it this way, because there's another concept that gets utilized this way that I have a lot more facility with, and that's addiction, where people will talk about having addictive personalities or being addicted to X, Y, or Z. In order for us to determine clinically whether something is an addiction, of course, there's physical dependence. There are things that if you utilize them in certain ways, certain patterns of usage, you become physically dependent on them. And if you stop using them or significantly decrease using them, it causes problems, including up to killing you, which alcohol can do. If you are an alcoholic and you use enough alcohol for enough time and you stop cold turkey, you can die. But then there's also the category of what we would call addictions, which is not a physical dependence. You're not going to have physical withdrawal symptoms, but you are engaging in the thing more than you want to, or to the extent that it is detrimental, significantly detrimental to you in some way or shape, some way, shape, or form. So in other words, gardening can be addictive. Of course, video gaming can be addictive, and the internet can be addictive, and social media and phones can be addictive, and people talk about this stuff all the time, and gambling can be addictive, but so can gardening, so can reading, so can literally any enjoyable activity. And what people will use to justify like the medicalization of, for example, gambling addiction is to say, well, what happens in a gambler's brain, a person who's addicted to gambling, what happens in their brain is similar to what happens in the brain of somebody who has a physical dependence on a chemical. By which what we're talking about is patterns of dopamine primarily, how dopamine is released by the activity, because dopamine is the pleasure chemical. It's the neurotransmitter associated with feelings of enjoyment, pleasure, accomplishment, meaningfulness, that kind of stuff. When you feel good about what's happening, there's dopamine involved. It's the reward chemical, will be called sometimes. But what that means is anything that you do, anytime you are feeling pleasure and joy, dopamine is being released into your brain. So anything you enjoy could be addictive. There are some things, many things have built-in limits on their ability to be detrimental. So gardening, for example, well, you're not gardening in the middle of the night, most likely. Whereas video gaming, you can game 24 hours a day. So it has there's a likelihood that it becomes more problematic than gardening might, as well as there's physical, like a lot of things that you enjoy and would theoretically love to continue to do constantly all the time. You can't because it involves using your body and you get tired and you have to take breaks, or you can't because you have to go to a particular place to do it that you can't go all the time. So there's nothing wrong with experiencing pleasure when you do something. We want that to happen. The problem is if something is pleasurable and that experience of joy and pleasure does not decrease over repeat usages, right? That if the first time is really fun and the second time is pretty fun and the third time and the fourth time, okay, I'm bored. Well, then that's not something that you're going to engage in to the exclusion of all else. But if the first time and the second time and the 20th time and the 500th time, it's just as enjoyable each time, well, why wouldn't you continue to do that unless for some reason you were unable to, like you couldn't access it or couldn't sustain the ability to do it, including that it will make it difficult, if not impossible, for you to do other things that you also think are important or necessary or helpful or beneficial, but are not as enjoyable as that thing. That you can get stuck in patterns of just doing that thing over and over and over and over and over and over, even though as you're doing it, you're like, I should do this other thing, but this is so fun, I'm going to do it again. So we call that addiction as well. So what I would say, leaving aside the clinical side of it, if you're concerned that you might have an eating disorder, I would talk to somebody who is a specialist in eating disorders so that they can help figure that out, because I can't. Certainly, even if I was an expert on it, I can't give a generic, well, this is the split. But what I would say is if your pattern of eating bothers you, if the way in which you relate to food, both in how you think about it and your body weight and shape and image, and also the pattern of behavior with how you engage with food, if those things are bothering you and you tried to make changes and those changes are not working, then I think it's worth considering it the same way we would consider something to be addictive, where there's not like a very clear cut, well, this is not and this is. The question is it detrimental to you? Are you doing it more than you want to be doing it? Is it causing you significant problems and yet you persist in doing it anyway? So effectively, If you've identified it as a problem, you are trying to change the way that you do it, and everything you're trying has not worked, then yes, it's worth getting support with that, looking into that more. Why? What else would you do? Continue to just try it. But if your question is, well, I have no problem with the way that I eat, I am not experiencing any detrimental, like nothing that I can tie to whether or not, but I'm worried that I might be considered to have an eating disorder, then that's a different question. And if you're not experiencing detrimental effects of something, this is getting into questions about health. Health, like all things that are based on statistical large scale research, valid and helpful and important to know, and very little to do with an individual case. That something which is considered to be healthy behavior means that on a large scale, on average, humans seem to have better outcomes correlated with this behavior, or worse outcomes that correlate with this unhealthy behavior. But an individual person might do all kinds of unhealthy things and still have a long, healthy, fulfilling, good feeling life. Another person might do all kinds of healthy things and still get sick and have a hard life or die young. So what matters is the individual. These things are guideposts that are saying, hey, if you're struggling with a thing, if you don't know what to do about a thing, here's the average. So maybe aim for that to start, because most people seem to do best. Sleep, for example, 8 hours of sleep. Does everybody need 8 hours of sleep a day? No. How would we, even if somebody theoretically needed exactly 8 hours of sleep a day? Good question. No, I'm not Indian. I'm assuming that you mean, from the subcontinent of India. And no, I'm not. I'm also not indigenous. I have very small amounts of indigenous ancestry. I don't even know what it is, but a very small amount. I'm mixed race, a lot of different things. And my hair and beard right now culturally probably evoke Indian culture more than other things, for sure. But yeah, I'm mixed race. My mother is primarily white, various versions of white, Scottish and German, Welsh. My father is also mixed race himself. His mother was from Papua New Guinea. His father was from Indonesia. I've got Indonesian ancestry, Chinese ancestry, African ancestry on my father's side, and then mostly European ancestry on my mother's side. So happy to answer that question. I get it a lot. And just to be aware that some people will not be happy with questions like that. Some people will consider questions like that to be microaggressions. But I understand, and I'm happy to answer it. Not a problem at all. Yeah, the most important, these things are called disorders for a reason. They're not diseases. They literally don't meet the criteria to be considered a disease. What a disease is has specific definable criteria. And one of those things is that we have to know the mechanical action of what is happening. We have to be able to look into a cell and see a virus, or we have to be able to look and see the tumor and know what's happening and what it's doing that result in the symptoms. Behavior does not work that way. Cognition and emotion don't work that way. They are far, far too complex for us to be able to identify the specific mechanical action that underlies the symptomatic experience. So what we're looking at is the experience. And that means that what's most important is your experience. If you do not like what is happening, if you want it to be different, then it's a problem and it's worth addressing. If you like what is happening, if you have no problem with the way things are going, then it's not worth considering a symptom. We call them disorders. What that means is we've drawn a circle around what we call ordered behavior or orderly behavior. And any other pattern of behavior that is not that is considered disordered behavior. It is not orderly. That does not mean that it is unhealthy necessarily. And I want to be clear, I'm talking about disorders generally. I'm not talking about eating disorders. Disordered behavior is not inherently unhealthy. It is not inherently detrimental. It is not inherently the result of some form of deficiency. It just means disorderly behavior. And what is ordered and what is disordered is based on cultural conceptions. There's a reason that what's in the DSM changes over time. Homosexuality used to be a clinically diagnosable condition in the DSM. That wasn't removed until the 1970s. I can't remember the exact year. I want to say 76. I should learn that. These are constructs. Constructs are useful. We construct an idea of a thing because it is useful. It serves some role. We look at symptoms, symptomatic experiences, and we notice correlations. Well, this person who is experiencing anhedonia, the loss of interest or deriving less or no joy from previously joyful activities. Well, if someone's experiencing anhedonia and they're also experiencing significant disturbances to their sleep patterns, and then we see somebody else with those two things and somebody else with those two things, and you see enough and you start to say, okay, these things seem correlated. And then we notice that it's also correlated with this and also correlated with that. And eventually we come up with the construct of depression, a condition in which these different symptoms are experienced, or some number of these symptoms are experienced, and these clinical criteria definitely are met. And now we call it the criteria, or we call it the clinical, a clinical diagnosis. We say you have the thing. And we need to do that in our culture because we need to be able to code it. We need to be able to have insurance and medical treatments and procedures and blah, 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 because all of this stuff is governed by that. But these things, behavior, we cannot identify, even though we can look at correlations and say, in people who are depressed, which is a label that we've applied because they meet certain clinical criteria, they're experiencing certain things in tandem and in certain patterns, and we say they're depressed, and then we study them as compared to a control population and see correlations. Oh, these people seem to be, that their serotonin levels are different than the control population. So that might be significant here. And then we can design treatments that manipulate the serotonin levels and then observe, does that result in decreased experience of the symptomatic behaviors or experiences? And if it does at a significant scale, we say, great, this is a treatment. But even then, we don't say every person with depression will be benefited by antidepressants. And we certainly don't say that if you have depression, the only thing that can be done, the only thing that will help you are antidepressants. Some people, antidepressants make it worse. Some people, it doesn't help at all. But enough people, percentage-wise, most people who try them report benefit that we consider it to be a good thing to suggest, generally speaking. Psychiatry and medicine, right? Not me. Therapists, we don't suggest medication. We're not allowed to. It's not our job. So the first question is that, are you bothered by your eating? Are you experiencing physical or behavioral or emotional or cognitive symptoms, things that you don't like, that you think might be related to the way in which you eat? Are you experiencing health symptoms, physical symptoms that you think might be related to the way that you eat? Are you worried that the way that you eat might cause problems for you later on down the line? That would be a cognitive symptom, right? Anxiety and fear and worry about what might happen later on, maybe even rumination, right? Or just plain and simple, without any reasoning or connection to symptom, do you just straight up not like it? I don't like how I'm doing this. I want to do it differently. Then it's worth investigating further. And if you can come up with solutions on your own, great. But if you can't, look for other suggestions, other support, other ideas. That's the best way I can answer that question. Are certain personality traits common in individuals with eating disorders? These are big questions, and I am answering them. I'm a big old weirdo. I'm answering them in weird ways because that question, every question relies on presumptions, right? The use of language at all relies on certain presumptions. This one relies on the idea of personality traits. And my first response would be to talk about what is personality, what is a personality trait? Because typically people think of those things as static. It's something about me that I can't change, as intrinsic and inherent, that this is just how I am, how I've always been, how I was destined to be. It's not the result of any experiences or shifts or exposure to environmental conditions. And predictive, that because it's static, it's going to continue to happen and it will continue to be this way. What we're really talking about is either patterns of behavior or experience. So either we notice that, for example, when someone is in a room with people they don't know well, they don't talk. And that seems to happen consistently. At least not every time, of course, but a lot of the time, as compared to the average, when they're in a room with new people, they don't talk. Well, then we could say that person is shy, because that's an accurate description of an observed pattern of behavior. But then if we internalize that as a personality trait, which many people do, I am a shy person, well, now it's predictive. I'm trapped. Even though no matter how shy you are, sometimes you behave in ways that if someone were to watch you, they would say that person is not shy at all. It's about the context, the times and places and conditions and who else is around that dictates how you behave. But yes, some people are reliably or noticeably more likely to behave in a way we would call shy than other people would be. So that's what we're talking about when we talk about personality traits. So either it's a pattern of behavior or a pattern of experience, that I might be very anxious, like as compared to the average person, I might be a lot more anxious in a lot more circumstances. And even though that anxiety doesn't necessarily manifest in some observable behavior, I can report, I can tell you, I get anxious from this and this and this and this and this. And then we could say, oh, anxious personality. But again, it's just a description of a pattern. And remember that all behavior and all experience, everything you think, do, feel, is the result of an interaction between the individual and the context. Part of what I think could be improved in our industry generally, therapy wide, and I think that's likely true of eating disorder work as well, although again, not my area of expertise, so I can't say for sure, is that we over focus on the individual. That if an individual has an eating disorder, well, what is it about the individual that made them have the eating disorder? And therefore, whatever we're trying to target and shift and change in order to make it so they no longer have the eating disorder, or at least no longer exhibit the patterns of behavior that concern us, that we got to change something, do something that changes them. And we don't look as much at the context. Some types of, let's call it treatment, therapeutic processes, some types of treatment involve a lot of change in environment, in context, in stimuli. And eating disorder work often falls under that category, where we're putting somebody into a residential program where the access to food and how they're monitored and whatever, it's a different set of circumstances. And now they start to behave differently. And sometimes that does translate when they leave that environment, that they continue the new pattern of behavior. Sometimes they leave that environment and return to the old environment, and the old pattern of behavior comes right back, because the behaviors and the experiences were the result of the interaction between. So what we're hoping to do is, by manipulating or controlling the environment, theoretically, we're helping somebody to learn something, develop an ability to do something, become more proficient or fluent in a particular type of behavior, so that even when they leave the environment, they're more likely to continue to behave in that way. But the environment matters. It really, really does. It's not just about you. So having said all that, are there personality traits common in individuals with eating disorders? I don't know. What I can say is disordered eating certainly has patterns of commonality in a lot of neurodivergent people, that anything that you would consider to be indicative of somebody who is theoretically less aware of their body and their body's needs and more aware of their thoughts, because that's a very common dichotomy. Some of us, myself included, especially neurodivergent people, I think everything's cognition, everything is reason and thought, lack of a better word. I don't rely as much on my body, which includes things like not noticing signals from my body very easily of hunger, thirst, pain, whatever. Right now, my mouth is so dry that as soon as I said that, and because that made me think about it, the sides of my mouth and my lips are sticking to my gums. I can hear the clicking from that. and I have a bottle of water right here, and I still don't notice it or do anything about it until I consciously think about and try to focus in on it. So that will definitely correlate with disordered eating, unless somebody has automated their eating process. So, for example, I've never eaten breakfast. I'm not good at it. Partly it's just, who knows, maybe biological patterns, but my experience of it is when I wake up in the morning, I'm like, it takes me a minute to put myself together. I'm not feeling it, you know? And it's hard to then consciously think about, oh, I should eat. And I have no desire, intrinsic noticing of a desire to eat. So I just don't. Well, now I've automated it because I've determined that it is important to me. I've run my own experiments with myself to note when I eat protein in the morning, it seems like that correlates with the days where things are a little bit better for me than days when I don't. So I eat a protein bar and a banana every morning so I don't have to think about it. So if you have that pattern of, I would call it deprioritized interoception, that you don't tend to notice signals from inside the body until they're more extreme, then you might want to focus in on creating automated eating patterns, or that's what I'm looking for. Constructing reminders, building external reminders rather than the interoceptive signals to remind you to check in with yourself not constantly, check in with yourself continuously, every so often, about, am I hungry? Should I eat? So that would be one. Another is that a lot of eating disorder presentation has a lot to do with control, that people who otherwise are feeling as though they don't have a lot of control over the things that at least they can control their own body and their own intake of food. So you'll see a lot, not everybody, but a lot of the time there will be detailed notes about exactly what I'm eating and how many calories it takes and all the things that I'm doing and how much calories they burn. So there can be some kind of obsessive qualities to that, but I would be careful about looking at personality traits. I'm also curious about who's asking the question and why they're asking. They're not here. Because if you're asking because you're worried that you have certain personality traits that might mean you would have an eating disorder later on in life, well, okay, that you can pay more attention to that and be vigilant about your pattern of eating, but it's certainly not predestined. If you're asking because you're looking at somebody else that has certain personality traits that you're worried might mean they develop an eating disorder later on, same deal. Be vigilant, sure, but no constellation of personality traits results in you will therefore definitely have this, right? It just, watch out for it. And if you're talking about, well, do I have it right now, or does this person have an eating disorder right now, then don't use personality traits as a way to evaluate that. But maybe it's just curiosity, intellectual curiosity, I don't know. Different types of treatment interventions you think work best for treating eating disorders. That one I'm not going to answer because I definitely don't know. There are entire massive centers, like residential programs, hospitals dedicated to treating eating disorders. I don't know what might work best or not. But talking from a neurodiversity standpoint, executive functioning standpoint, if you're wanting to change your pattern of anything, but your pattern of eating, or if you're wanting to assist someone else in changing their pattern of anything, we want to bring the cost down of doing that thing, make it easier to do rather than trying to make it more important to do. Because it is quite likely that they are already considering it to be, or you are already considering it to be, very important. And anything that emphasizes that, including by adding rewards and punishments and whatever to things, is unlikely to change anything. It is quite likely that the reason that the change isn't happening, that the patterns that you don't like are persisting, is because even though you think it's worth doing, you can't afford to do it. Maybe that's because resources are taken up by other things. Maybe it's because it's just a prohibitively expensive thing to do. Even if you had nothing else going on, it still is not possible. Who knows? But look at reducing cost and providing better options rather than trying to ban people from the patterns of behavior. That's an emergency thing, right? If somebody is engaging in a pattern of behavior that we think is dangerous, then yeah, we might elect that it is worth, I might elect for myself that it is worth cutting myself off from this thing, just prohibiting, making it so that I cannot do that. But I'm doing it for a reason. And we hope that if it's a bad option, if there are detrimental, if it costs more than is sustainable or seems appropriate, whatever, we hope that it's inaccurate, that the person thinking that it's their best option is just that they don't realize that there are other options that are be better, or that they don't realize how bad of an option it is. And we can do education and exposing people to other modalities and whatever to try and rectify that. But if they already know all those things, have looked at all those things, and it's still coming out to be their best option, it's possible that it's because those other things are prohibitively costly. They can't afford to do other. We don't want to take away somebody's best option. It makes things worse. Even when the best option, the thing that they're doing, is demonstrably, provably unhealthy or bad or detrimental, causing them problems. Because what we don't know is if they weren't engaging in that behavior, would things be better or worse for them overall? We think and we're hoping better, but we never know if they weren't doing X, what else would they be doing instead? What else would they be experiencing instead? So try and bring down the cost of the options that you're thinking are better, and or try to come up with other better options that you're not aware of or they're not aware of. What that means in terms of eating disorders, at least some of the time, is whatever stuff you like to eat, make sure that that stuff is around all the time. Especially, I don't know how we got this far without me mentioning one thing that is considered to be an eating disorder in the DSM, but people don't generally talk about as an eating disorder, is avoidant restrictive intake. Meaning, I will only eat certain kinds of food. I avoid certain kinds of intake. I've restricted the types of food that I'm going to eat, or the patterns or the ways or the times or the amounts in which I'm going to eat. A lot of that is due to sensory issues. So even though theoretically a balanced diet is healthy, eating some food is better than not eating some food. If a person only can eat ramen, that's the only thing that they like, then just make sure that you've got as much ramen around as necessary so that they're able to, instead of saying, no, I shouldn't eat more ramen, but I don't want to eat anything else, so I won't eat anything at all. Observe what things already work, what things are already as easy and as enjoyable as possible, and try to emphasize and utilize those things. Because that's better than not, right? A lot of, not in eating disorder focused work, but in working with people with disordered eating. And what you eat impacts how you think and how you feel emotionally and how you feel physically. Of course it does. And so, yes, there are cycles, right? If I'm depressed, part of that depression, one of the symptoms of depression I might be experiencing is eating significantly less or almost nothing at all, which then makes it more difficult for me to regulate my emotions or my cognition in any other kind of a way, which then makes it harder to eat, which then makes it harder. So these things cycle. And what we want is easy ways to change it, that you eat whatever is there, just have it available, have it visible. So you don't even have to remember, you just see it and you're like, oh, that sounds good. I would rather somebody be eating like a bunch of sugar than nothing at all. And maybe that's bad medical advice. And if you're a nutritionist or a dietitian, please feel free to tell me. I would love to know. But from a behavioral standpoint, a mental health standpoint, I hate that term, I would rather that there be some calories in the body, even if those calories are associated with, fats or lipids or carbohydrates or whatever kind, that there would be a better way to distribute those things. I want the diet to lose weight, but I'm nervous it will lead to an eating disorder. What should my first steps be? Ooh, that's a good question and a big one. I'll say this. Losing weight is never the aim. We talk about aims and measures, right? Aim being, what is it that I want to be different than it is? Measures being sometimes aims are difficult to assess because they're long term, or because they're fairly vague, or because they're experiential or subjective. So I come up with some other way of measuring progress. So in this particular case, do you want to lose weight? Well, yes, because you think if you lose weight, what? I want to feel better about the way that I look. I want to feel as though what you care about most likely is either changing your physical experience of your body, like having more energy, being, able to do active things more for longer periods of time, etc. Changing your perception of your level of attractiveness, changing other people's perception of your level of attractiveness, which really comes back to, I want to perceive that other people perceive me as more attractive, or some version of that. There's also things like, I know for myself, sensitivities are involved in this, that when I start to put on more weight, the way that my shirt falls on my body and on my stomach and on my sides is very, very uncomfortable for me, which I am sure is at least in part informed by internalized fat phobia, that it's a reminder that I've put on more weight and so I don't like it. But it might not be, and why do we need to distinguish that, right? It's still a sensory experience. So what I would suggest is first steps are look at what it is that you are trying to accomplish by losing weight. Because nobody gives a crap if they step on a scale and the number is lower than it was yesterday. That means nothing, except that it correlates to something else. There's something else you're trying to get, and the way that you're measuring how you get there. Okay, I want to be more energetic or have my clothes fit differently. Cool. Well, then I'm going to come up with some ideas of things to try to see if that works. Great. I put those into practice. Now I need to measure whether those things are working. And how am I going to do that? One very easy way is to look at whether the number on the scale is going down. Even though that in and of itself doesn't matter, it correlates to those other things. So first, look at what are the other things. What is it that you're really trying to accomplish? And if you're worried that trying to do a diet, which by the way, dieting just generally, not a good thing to do. We can talk a little bit more about that. I might run a little long today because I was late and I don't have an appointment right at 2. Yeah, I'll talk about dieting in a little bit, actually. So first step would be evaluate what it is that you're trying to accomplish. Second would be, if you're worried about a diet, which I think you should be, not necessarily because it might lead to an eating disorder, but just because dieting generally is not very effective or efficient or whatever. It has its problems. We'll talk about it. Consider whether you can accomplish that in other ways. If it's a sensory experience of how your clothes fit, can you buy new clothes or tailor the clothes that you have now to fit your body better without changing your body? If it's about getting more energy, can you change other patterns of physicality so that you end up feeling as though you have more energy? If it's about attractiveness, certainly there are other things that you can do in terms of your own experience of how attractive you consider yourself to be. There are other things you can do besides just losing weight to modify that. And same for if what you're concerned about is your perception of how attractive other people find you to be. There are other things that you can do. So look into that and see whether any of those other options are beneficial for you. I want to read these other questions real quick because otherwise I'm going to talk about dieting generally and it's going to take all the time. Groups you've noticed that are more at risk for eating disorders. We kind of talked about that already, but I'll talk about it more. How can I best support someone who is struggling with an eating disorder? Talk about that. As a therapist, what resources will help me feel more knowledgeable about working with clients with eating disorders? So that last one, I don't have a good answer for because, like I said, not my specialty. So I don't have a bunch of resources about, I haven't read a lot of books. Or my best resource for eating disorders or anything else is social media, particularly in finding and following and listening to the people who are diagnosed with the condition. So I want to learn from people with eating disorders. If I want to learn more about eating disorders, I want to go on Twitter or whatever, find people who talk about their experience of having eating disorders. I would always, always rather learn from people who experience it than people who are experts in it but don't experience it. Experts are great. I'm an expert. We have utility. But I would always rather learn from the person who's experiencing it first before going and looking at experts. Otherwise, it colors your experience to the point that when you hear from people who are experiencing it, sometimes you'll be dismissive. No, they're lying. They're in denial. That's not what the experts say is really going on here. How can I best support someone who is struggling with an eating disorder? Communicate with them is always the answer to any question that starts with how can I best support someone, whatever comes after that. Communicate with them, find out what they need, be honest and authentic. Don't make it about, I think what you're doing is unhelpful or unhealthy or harmful. Make it about your experience. I am stressed. I am nervous. I am worried about what it is that you're doing. I care about you and I want you to be well. And I am nervous that you won't be, because then you're owning it. It is your thing. And it might be, or at least to some extent, probably is informed by the fat phobic culture that we live in, which, by the way, all the data that I'm aware of disproves any idea that there is a solid correlation between fat, like fat in terms of describing somebody's appearance, not the substance of fat in the body. All the data I'm aware of, not my expertise, but I have looked into some of this. All the data I'm aware of suggests that there is no correlation, no broad and direct correlation between being fat and experiencing poor health outcomes that can't be explained by fat phobia itself. In other words, people will experience problems, go to the doctor, and the doctor dismisses and says, okay, lose 20 pounds first, then we'll look into whether anything else. So care is delayed, and that causes problems in health outcomes. But there doesn't seem to be an intrinsic link between being a fat person, the way that we would talk about that. I don't know why I'm doing this. Curves, I suppose. I guess that's where I notice fat on my body, is on my hips. And there's no intrinsic connection between that and poor health outcomes in some statistical sense. So communicate with them and share from your perspective and ask them what they're looking for, what they need. Are they bothered by it? If we're talking about someone with an identified, thank you, I appreciate that. If we're talking about somebody with an identified eating disorder, that they and you are both, yes, I have an eating disorder, please help me, then it would be about talking to whomever it is that has done the diagnosis, whatever treatment that has been working and helping. But beyond that, like I said already, bring down the cost. Provide them options. Don't say, eat this thing now. Just say, do you want to eat? And if they say no, okay, do you want to eat now? And you just keep asking over and over and over, instead of saying you must sit down and eat right now. I am certain that there are cases in which saying you must sit down and eat right now is the best option. So I'm not saying that's a bad thing to do, but preferable is lower the cost, up the value, provide things that are yummy and easy to eat, that are enjoyable, and make it easy for them to eat them. Make it visible, not in the closet in a box somewhere, right out there on a bowl so I see it all the time. Groups I've noticed that are more at risk for eating disorders. So I don't have any personal anecdotal experience of this, other than to say that neurodivergent people, and particularly ADHD, have seemed more likely to me to have deprioritized interoception and therefore have disordered eating. And then, of course, I could just say the things that, like, culturally we're aware of, that this is far more common for women than it is for men, although it is plenty common for men as well, especially young men. Although that tends to go, when young men are having body image issues, that tends to go more in the direction of body dysmorphia than it does to eating disorders, but it does both for sure. Yeah, I don't want to say more than that, because beyond that, it would just be like speculation on my part, not any actual knowledge. All right, dieting. We're going to talk about dieting for just a little bit, and then we're going to wrap up. So all the evidence we have about dieting is that it is not a meaningful solution to anything. Part of that is because being overweight or obese, as defined by like the medical community, apparently, as to the best of my ability, looking at the data to tell. I say data, I'm reading other people's studies, right? Like I'm not generating data of my own. Part of that is because things like BMI and stuff just don't mean anything. I am 6'5". When I was in high school, I weighed 185 pounds, which right now, I'll say, I just realized I should have, at the very beginning of this, given a trigger warning, and I apologize for not having done that. I hope that by now anybody who would find any of this discussion to be upsetting would have realized and left, and I apologize for not giving a heads up on that. So I'll say now, what I'm about to do is say actual numbers of weight in reference to myself to kind of try to make this point about body mass index, the BMI. Right now, I weigh 245 pounds, and you can see what I look like. So you can imagine same height, but 60 pounds less. And I was considered by BMI to be overweight. At the weight that I am right now, I'd have to look it up, but I'm pretty sure that I would be considered to be obese, maybe even into morbidly obese. There is some very, very outdated junk science, even in the mainstream medical community, specifically around body weight. Fat phobia is a particular, I'm not trying to, I like the medical community. I go to the doctor. I believe in Western medicine. It's not a conspiracy. It's none of that stuff. But specifically when it comes to fat, we have a lot of evidence to suggest that there are problematic ways of looking at that in the medical community. Now, even if being overweight is or was theoretically correlated to bad health outcomes, dieting doesn't actually help you do anything about that. That if you look at long-term studies, sorry, my mouth is so dry. That if you look at long-term studies, first of all, the vast majority of people who attempt a diet won't ever lose weight on the diet at all. And then of those who do, that weight comes back. And the further out you go from when they did the diet, the smaller the percentage of people who lost 5 or more pounds gets that have still kept that 5 or more pounds off. If you are trying to change the weight, the fat, the shape of your body, which I don't have a problem with. There's nothing wrong with wanting yourself to be different than you are. It can get inappropriate. It can get extreme. It is absolutely informed. And I'm not talking just about weight. I mean, generally, this is what we do as humans. We observe our experience and we judge it. Some of it we like, some of it we don't. There's nothing wrong with not liking something or wanting something to be different. What's wrong then is what happens next, how that gets channeled into emotion or behavior or cognition or patterns of things. Whether you do something, and if you do, what do you do, and how do you feel, and so on and so forth. But yes, wanting to be different is fine. That's just how we are. We always want to be different. We want to learn new things, develop new skills, change things, change our hair, change our beard, whatever. So if that's something you're trying to do, then you want to look at making changes to the way that you go about your daily patterns of living, not by picking a particular diet, especially not by picking restrictive diets, which most diets are. If you are going to do some kind of dieting, then I would suggest that the model that I am aware of that seems to be the least harmful, I'll say that, are models that increase your awareness of what it is that you're doing, like Weight Watchers, for example. And of course, there's still a problem there because I could be wrong about Weight Watchers, but I'm pretty sure that Weight Watchers still gives you a budget of points, right? So it's still a restrictive pattern of eating. You cannot eat more than X, Y, or Z, or if you do, it's a problem or whatever. But being more aware of the calories that you're putting into your body and the calories that you're expending, I don't think there's anything wrong with being aware of that stuff and then being able to make more adjustments to your patterns of behavior with that new enhanced awareness of what it is that you're doing and how it impacts you. But if you want to change something about that long term, you got to change something about your daily patterns of living. If that is that you're going to change the way that you eat, start by trying to give yourself better options rather than by trying to take away from yourself the options that you've been engaging in. If you want to do more than that or different than that, look at the patterns and try to think about what function it's filling for you and if you can get some other way to get that function. I know for myself, for example, I have a tendency to use eating, especially at night, as a form of stimulation. I'm understimulated, and so I snack on things that crunch. I don't care what they taste like. I don't care what the calories or vitamins, I need the tactile sensation of crunch, crunch, crunch. I can grab a thing at a time, whatever. So at a certain point, I noticed I was eating so much salt, and I had a theory that that was causing problems for me. So I wanted to switch the pattern. And so I started buying pistachios because I can still get that tactile stimulation, but it takes me longer. It slows me down to pop it open one at a time and eat it and pop it up instead of like 2 or 3, a handful of something over and over. So we want to look at the theories of why would you be doing a thing that you're theoretically not wanting to do and find a different way to meet those needs. There's other things I could do to be stimulated, obviously, right? Not just different forms of eating food or whatever. Yeah, the diet industry is a huge, huge, huge industry. And the diet industry does not make money by reams and reams of new people coming in wanting to diet, significantly changing their body weight and then leaving and never coming back for another diet, but other new people come in. It's the same small group of people trying diet after diet after diet after diet after diet because they don't work. This is generally true of all like behavioral restrictions. This is why I'm trying to say make better options cheaper. Give more better options. Don't take away what somebody's already doing because it's already their best option. Educate people, sure, because they might be wrong. They might already have better options that they just don't know about or don't understand that those options are better or that what they're doing is bad in the way that it is theoretically bad. So we can try that stuff. But if that stuff doesn't change anything, then we need to give people better options. When we're talking about lifestyle changes, that's what we mean. We mean change things so that your new, best, most enjoyable way to get through your day is also the way that results in whatever outcome that you're looking for. Instead of just trying to say to yourself, no. Negative aims, trying to block yourself from doing something, having an impulse, a desire, a thought to do a thing and saying, no, that's bad, is effortful. Every time you have that impulse, that thought, that desire, it takes conscious effort to block yourself from it. And someday, sooner or later, you're going to be too tired. You're going to be too distracted. It's going to be too difficult. The impulse will be too strong and you'll go back to the old way of doing things. You need better options. So that's what I would say. First, look at what you're trying to accomplish by losing weight in the first place. And then if you are still comfortable with losing weight is my best way to try and accommodate that or accomplish that, then look at ways to do it by giving yourself better options rather than worse. And yeah, especially for neurodivergent people, sometimes that does mean things like meal prepping. Cook your meals all on Sunday because part of the reason that you're eating things that you don't want to be eating is because they're easy and convenient. And when it's time to eat, you're exhausted or you're distracted or you need something fast. Getting fresh produce and cutting it up and putting it into Tupperwares on Sunday so that when you need a snack, here's a bunch of peppers cut up. And I like cut up peppers. I just don't usually eat those as a snack because it's a whole pepper and I'd have to cut it up and I don't want to do that, So look at those kinds of things. I ran 12 minutes over, but almost still about exactly an hour-ish. Thank you guys for being here. Hope it's helpful. I appreciate the questions, and thanks to Margaret for generating the questions and doing all that. It will be here same time next week. We might be changing the time of this somewhat soon because I might have someone else be joining me soon, and we'll announce that and make it clear to everybody. But for now, next week, 1 p.m. to 2 p.m. Central Time. I hope this was helpful. Please, if I'm saying something that's wrong or bothers you or is problematic, please tell me. I like to learn those things. I would much, much rather know if I'm saying something that has the potential to cause harm or is actually causing harm. I want to know about that. I promise it's not a thing I'll get defensive and say, how dare you suggest that? I know that I unintentionally cause harm. If I'm doing it, I want to know about it. Please reach out, especially on a topic like this where I'm trying to be very clear that I have thoughts about some of it, information about some tangential or related aspects, but the thing itself is not, I'm not an expert. All right. Thank you. Goodbye.